Hello, and welcome to the Turbulent World with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. The images of Israel's reduction of Gaza to a pile of rubble and destructive West Bank raids speak as much about the Strip's devastation and Israeli West Bank counterinsurgency tactics as they indicate Israel's vision of Gaza's post war future and the Jewish state's likely response to a potential long term Hamas led insurgency. The building blocks of Israel's Gaza war strategy date back to this century's first decade. The war's high civilian casualty rate and degree of physical devastation highlight the military's toxic merger of its Dahiyya doctrine and urban warfare strategy, pumped up by dehumanizing and brutalizing language employed by government officials, politicians, commanders, and religious leaders, and breakdowns in military command and control. The images of Israeli bulldozers in devastated Gazan towns and cities, and holes blasted into the walls of structures still standing, are telltale signs. So are the videos of daily Israeli raids on West Bank towns and refugee camps that turn built environments into military assets to quash a burgeoning armed insurgency in the occupied territory. Tactics that go beyond the utility of the Strip's erstwhile built environment, including the seeming targeting of officials of Hamas's pre war administration of Gaza, many of whom were on the payroll of the internationally recognized Palestine Authority, complement the merger. The targeting seems intended to diminish Palestinians' ability to govern themselves. Because contemporary urban warfare plays itself out increasingly through the destruction, construction, reorganization, and subversion of space, architecture and planning become among the most important reference disciplines for military men, said Eyal Weizman, a Haifa born pioneer of forensic architecture that focuses on the intersection of architecture, armed conflict, and violence. Mr. Weizmann describes an urban environment's trees, terraces, and residential buildings as weapons, ammunition, and barriers. He notes that hilltop Israeli settler homes on the West Bank have red roofs to distinguish them from Palestinian homes when the military attacks targets in the occupied territory. Mr. Weizmann says the homes are an optical instrument, a suburban scale optical device that can survey the entire territory around it. What the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising against occupation, in the first years of the 21st century revealed to Mr. Weizmann was how the Israeli military deliberately and destructively reorganized cities to deprive insurgents of their strategic advantage in an urban environment. Israel developed its urban warfare strategy in 2002 in battles for the West Bank towns of Jenin, Nablus, and the Balata refugee camp. In Jenin, widely viewed as the Palestinian resistance's ground zero, an Israeli column walked into an ambush in the early stages of the 11-day battle. More than 50 Palestinians and 23 Israeli soldiers were killed in the Jenin fighting. The military deployed Caterpillar D9 bulldozers in the battles to carve out new pathways and flatten homes to avoid being exposed to the city's existing road network. For Mr. Weizmann, the Israeli attacks on Jenin and Nablus were the laboratory for the US to think about urban warfare in Iraq. They were training in Israeli training sites in mock up cities built in the desert in the south, he said. Nablus, with a population of 150,000 residents, was one of the biggest laboratories in 2002 for the development of a new type of urban warfare. Israelis were studying how cities operate. They understood that in order to occupy the city, they need to move in a city in a different manner, Mr. Weizmann added. Planning for the attacks drew lessons from the 7 weeks-long siege and bombing of Beirut in 1982, that, in the words of a battalion commander, was not particularly successful. The battalion commander was responding to the mission statement of the Nablus operations overall commander, paratrooper Avi Kochavi, according to retired Brigadier General Shimon Nave, Israel's foremost military philosopher come urban theorist, and founder and former director of the Israeli Defense Forces Operational Theory Research Institute. The 2002 attack sought to eliminate a group of up to 200 armed insurgents that the Israeli military believed was operating in Nablus and the Balata refugee camp. More than 80 Palestinians, civilians, and combatants were killed, and numerous buildings destroyed or severely damaged in the operation. The attacks followed by the 2006 Lebanon War, in which Israeli airstrikes turned Dahiyeh, the Lebanese Shiite militia stronghold in southern Beirut, into a bewildering postmodern wilderness of shattered buildings, and subsequent Gaza wars in 2008 to 9, 2012, 2014, and 2021 shape Israeli strategy in the current war. The assault on Dahiyeh became the basis for the Dahiyeh Doctrine, first formulated in 2008 by General Gabi Eisenkot, a former chief of staff who recently resigned together with former defense minister Benny Gantz as a member of Prime Minister Netanyahu's now defunct war cabinet. The doctrine legitimizes the massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, encountering political violence and armed resistance. It holds that in asymmetric wars in which the enemy holds territory populated by a supportive population, the destruction of infrastructure and civilians' homes with disproportionate force is essential. Borders are not only on the surface. You see it very clearly in Gaza through the tunnels and the rockets, Mr. Weizmann said, referring to Hamas's underground tunnel network and its firing of rockets toward Israel. Like Dahiyeh, Mr. Weizmann noted that Nablus became the most influential case study for military study of operations in urban terrain. Based on and conducted through reshaping the battle space, the intention in the Nablus attack was not to gain territory or control it, but to be able to locate the members of the Palestinian resistance, kill them, and leave. Mr. Weizmann's analysis predates the current war, which validates his approach on a scale he could not have predicted. Israel's concept of urban warfare reverses traditional tactics in urban settings. The military does not kill enemy soldiers to obtain the strategic ground they occupy, but temporarily enters strategic ground to kill its enemies. Killing is not a byproduct of military maneuver, but the very essence of the current Israeli campaign against Palestinian guerrillas and terror, Mr. Weizmann said. The military appears unrestrained in Gaza, using the Air Force and Navy to execute the Dahiyeh Doctrine, while ground troops operate based on its 2 decades-old urban warfare strategy. In the West Bank, the mix of strategies involves a more limited version of the Dahiyeh Doctrine, with the use of bulldozers to destroy roads, other infrastructure, and homes, often earmarked for destruction as collective punishment, coupled with the tacit support for vigilante settler attacks on Palestinians. In 2002, the bulldozers cut literally new streets through the dense urban fabric to allow the tanks to come in. The resistance retreated into the core of the camp, and at the end of the battle, effectively, the bulldozers collapsed the heart of the camp on those fighters, Mr. Weizmann said. It wasn't the first time that Israel used bulldozers, but it was the first time that the bulldozers were integrated into the battlefield. The fleet of bulldozers grew exponentially, and the bulldozers became the means of Israeli fighting in a Palestinian urban fabric, Mr. Weitzman added. Israel's keen understanding of architecture's significance has inspired armed forces in the United States, Britain, and elsewhere to establish academies focused on turning built environments into military assets. In the current hostilities, Israel has expanded the strategy by driving armed vehicles into buildings that create holes in the walls through which the military can deploy soldiers. In an undated video, then Lieutenant Colonel Nave, dressed in a t shirt and baggy military pants, trains Israeli soldiers in his notion of urban warfare. By following the structure of the streets, I'm giving the insurgents my unit on a silver platter. At that point, you say, hold on. They are looking for my company. I have to teach them a lesson they won't forget. We leave the streets empty and enter the buildings by drilling holes in the wall, Mr. Navis said in the video. In an essay describing a war council in advance of the 2002 attacks, Mr. Nave warned the troops that the insurgents expect us to come in the old style, mechanized formations in cohesive lines, and massed columns conforming to the geometrical order of the street network pattern. Balata, almost deterministically, becomes a Palestinian Stalingrad. Responding to Mr. Nave's challenge, Amir, a battalion commander, argued the troops needed to organize ourselves for breaking through walls and moving through the houses of individual families, rather than attack from the street, while avoiding civilian casualties at all costs. Mr. Kochavi, the overall commander and graduate of Mr. Nave's Operational Theory Research Institute, embraced Mr. Amir's idea, adding, our movement through the buildings will push the insurgents into the streets and alleys, where we will hunt them down. Lost in today's Israeli war conduct that merges the Dahiev doctrine with Israeli urban warfare strategy are Mr. Kochavi's parting words at the end of the 2002 War Council. Remember, Palestinian civilians are victims not only of our wrath, but also of the sympathy of the insurgents who exploit them. In other words, a most deadly game in which they are the ultimate victims in every sense has been imposed on them. Be careful, show respect, and pay attention to their pragmatic needs, Mr. Kochavi cautioned. Thank you for joining me today. I am grateful to those who have become paid subscribers. I need some more to enable me to continue cutting through the fog of kinetic and information wars and offer fact-based analysis. No doubt you will have noticed that the turbulent world has no sponsors and no advertisers. This guarantees the column and podcast's independence. Instead, the turbulent world depends on the support of its readers and listeners to cover the cost of producing the column and podcast. You can contribute by clicking on Substack on the subscription button at jamesmdorsey.substack.com and checking one of the subscription buttons. Thank you, take care, and best wishes.